Hi, here we go again. We're just talking about being out in the swimming hole out in Kansas. And as I say, the thing that surprised me the most was how that water was brown in comparison to the waters of Lake Huron. Well, we stayed out in Kansas for a few days, and then we took Joseph Johns back to Fairfield and proceeded on our way back to Michigan. Now, what we did was that we went up into the northwestern corner of Iowa, where Dad wanted to visit an old friend of his called Leo Earlham. Leo and Dad had been together as young people in the county normal here in Rogers City, taught in the rural schools, and then Leo went into the ministry. And he was stationed in a small town in northwestern Iowa. And he lived there and had a parish there, and he had married a local girl out there and lived on a farm. And it wasn't too far from South Dakota. In fact, we went into the community of Sioux City, South Dakota one day. But I was going to say about this man, this Leo Earlham. As a hobby, just on the side, he raised St. Bernard dogs. And he had maybe a half a dozen of big dogs, and then they raised dogs and several litters a year, and then he sold those on the side, just as for something to do. Dad became fascinated with the big St. Bernard dogs, and asked Leo about what it would take to get one of them. And Leo said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do, George. He said, I'll give you one the next batch I get. And he said, all you have to do is just pay the freight on it. He said, I'll see that it's properly crated and with instructions for shipping. He said, I do this right along. And he said, all you do is have it delivered to you up there in Rogers City, and you'll have yourself a dog and my treat to you for coming to see me out here in Iowa. And so that's what happened. That's how we got Blondine, but I'll talk more about that later. Now, on the way back from Iowa, we crossed Iowa and up near the Illinois border. We took a ferry across the Mississippi River and then went into a little town called Galena. Galena was one of the homes of President Grant, and Dad wanted to see that town and wanted to see that home of President Grant's. And so we did. We went to Galena and stayed there for a little bit, and then proceeded on back across and came back to Michigan by way of the Upper Peninsula. And later on that year, here comes this crate. Dad had been notified that Leo had shipped a dog. Well, this dog came, and it was a dandy. It would probably weighed about 25 or 30 pounds, but it was well crated and well taken care of, and seemed to be a very happy young animal. We prepared a place for it in the backyard. Dad got a hold of a pen, which was an old stagecoach, and we built a pen out in the backyard adjacent to the back end of the garage, and about 12 by 12 or 12 by 15, and so the dog had a good place to roam around in. It was, well, some shade, and his dog seemed to be very happy. But he was happy only with the members of the family. He seemed to be very, very friendly to the members of the family. You could take him to the house, and you could play with him, and he was just like a great big roly-poly dog. Only thing is, he kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And it wasn't long where he was well over 100 pounds. But the thing is about him is that he didn't want to have anything to do with anybody except the immediate family. Somebody else would come around, he'd lunge at the iron or at the wire gate and snarled his teeth. And Dad said that from what he had read about him, that wasn't characteristic. And we were a little bit frightened. He was a little bit frightened about that dog. And so, because there were a large number of kids that always accumulated in our yard, because there was young George there, and there was young Grace and the twins, and they had a lot of friends. They were always coming in there for one reason or another. Now, the minute those young kids would walk up to that fenced enclosure, the dog would lunge at them. Well, that wasn't characteristic as far as my dad was concerned. He didn't like to have to keep that dog locked up that way all the time. Now, there was a good, big number of kids in that immediate area of our home at that time. I'll just rattle off a few of them that were frequently in the yard there. Now, they weren't always there, but these were people that would come in because Mother was always very, very friendly to all the kids in the neighborhood that came in. I remember there was Keith and Enolia McDonald, who would live just across the way. There was the DeVinson boys. There was young Henry and Bob. And there was young Ed Arscott, who later became Dr. Arscott. There was Del Bertram. There was Dorothy. And there was Helen Bertram. There was Ziggy, Ralph Zempel. There was Floyd Hemling. And there was Norval Beatty. There was Alice Schultz. And there was Jean Henley. There was Ellen Endress, who lived next door. And there was Alice and Esther Hilda later on. And Alice Carter. And Eleanor Harmon. And Lottie Kroll. There were just an awful lot of kids that used to come in the yard. And, of course, my mother was very, always liked to have the kids around. And, of course, one of the reasons that they liked to come around is their mother always fed them. Mother was always great at handing out her sugar cookies or coffee cake. Mother wasn't famous for her coffee cake, of course, as you well know. That was well known in the neighborhood, well known around town. And she also had fried homemade donuts. And then, of course, there was another thing that the girls will remember, and I think George probably too, and that was Mother's Red Pop. There was some kind of a little pill or concoction of concentrate of fruit juices that you could put 3 or 4 of them in a pitcher of water, stir them up, add a little sugar, and you got Red Pop, or Orange Pop, or Lemon Pop, or Raspberry, or Strawberry. And I don't know the name of that stuff, I think, but they kind of fizzed as you put them in water, and it was quite refreshing. Served with cold well water, it was very, very nice. And, of course, Mother would gladly serve that stuff up. She was always baking. And, of course, you remember her coffee cake that we loved so much. Well, Mother made that for everybody in the neighborhood, especially if something happened in the neighborhood, somebody got sick, or there was a death of somebody in the neighborhood. The first thing the mother would do was bake a coffee cake. The minute it was done, she would cover it with streusel, which was a combination of sugar and cinnamon, and that went over to the neighborhoods pronto. That was standard fare. Mother was also the official coffee cake baker, I think, for the Ladies' Aid of the Lutheran Church, because every monthly meeting, Mother would bake 3 or 4 of those great big pans of her coffee cake to take over there for the luncheon. Now, that dog, that Blondine, of course, as I say, that we had there at that time, that was a kind of a nuisance for all these kids to have to keep that dog tied up all the time. So Dad wrote Erlub and asked him what he thought about it. Erlub wrote back and said, don't do anything until I get there. He said, I'm coming to see some members of my family up in that area this summer, and he said, I'll stop in and take a look. Well, sure enough, in time, Leo did come. And I remember when he walked out the back kitchen door and down the steps, he walked toward the pen, and the dog immediately lunged at him and snarled. And he walked away for a while and came back and went over toward the pen and tried to pet the dog, and boy, the dog was just right on his ear. And he apparently knew enough about these animals that he'd been raising for some time. And I remember he said, George, he said, you'll have to get rid of him. He's no good. And that was all there was to it. He said, just get rid of him. He said, now I'll give you another one, no charge at all. He said, there's something happened. He said, don't ask me what. He said, I don't know. He said, I've heard that this occasionally happens, but he said, that dog should be friendly to everybody. He said, that's the characteristic of that dog. That's why they're so well liked all over the country, all over the world. So we did have to get rid of the dog. So that ended our expedition with Blondine, and within a few short period of time after that, we got another Kazan, another black mutt or two, before it all ended. And but I just wanted to kind of bring that thing in there. And so we'll go on from there. Now I want to go on again a little bit, if you go, retrieve it a little bit, talk a little bit more about that trip that Dad and her and I and George made out to Nebraska and Kansas. We carried our own meals and had our own tent. We didn't stay in motels. In fact, motels were just beginning to get started in the country at that time. They called them overnight cabins. But we had a tent which we attached to the side of the Ford car, and it made enough room so that we had some cots, some wooden army cots, and that was all stacked in that car. I don't know how we got all that stuff in there. There were a few little blankets. Of course, this was the summertime, so we didn't have to carry too much. And we would stop at where we stopped to camp was generally at a schoolhouse, a country schoolhouse area. There was always usually a water well there, and what Dad would do as we went along, and it got later in the afternoon, he would stop at a spot of school and then look around and see where the closest farm was. And we'd drive over to that farm, and Dad would go in and talk to the man or the lady of the house and told him, ask him whether he thought there'd be any objection if we camped overnight at the schoolhouse grounds, because not only was there water there, but there's usually an outside toilet. And I remember in one case, the fellow said no. He said, that's perfectly all right. And Dad assured him, he said, we wouldn't build any fire. But the fellow said, well, he said, that water is not very good. He said, if you notice, there's a little addition on that school, and that's where the new water supply is. But he said, you can get your water here. So Dad had a big 2-gallon earthen crock that we always carried in the car anyway, and that was filled with water so that we'd have water for coffee or to wash the dishes, whatever it was. And we would set up camp, and then if it wasn't, sometimes we had to cook inside the tent. And what we had for heating water was a little sterno stove. Now, sterno was what was called canned heat. It was a little metal container. You took the lid off, and all you did was touch a match to this paraffin material that had been loaded with naphtha, and there was a little metal stove that was set together, and it was very, very efficient. And we had a couple of those, and one of them was to heat the water for making coffee or for making water, and the other one was for a pan, whichever we had. Now, we had a kind of a standard meal that we served for breakfast. Every morning for breakfast would be scrambled eggs with a little bacon, or fried eggs with a little bacon on one of those dishes, and then the other water was made for coffee purposes. And then after the eggs were done, well, then there was a little contraption that you put together, and you could put 4 pieces of bread on there, and it acted as a kind of a toaster. These were very efficient little items. I don't know whatever happened to those stoves, but they were very, very nice for a trip just of that kind. And for noon, we would just stop, and most of the time at noon we had fruit. We had bananas. We would stop at some store, or oranges or apples, and a few other cookies, and sometimes a bottle of milk. And then in the evening, again, we had a variety of foods that Dad would get at the stores as we went along. But we always had plenty to eat. But but as I say, we ordinarily stopped at schoolhouses because usually they had a good supply of water, and most of in those days the wells were outside, and after you pump off a few pails, the water was usually very good. But we usually checked with the farmer first to make sure that it was all right to stay there, and that's what we did. We didn't spend any money on motels or hotels. Everything except when we got to Nebraska and Kansas, of course, then we used the regular bedrooms. But it was a very, very delightful trip to do it in that manner. I don't know just how in the world in that car we stored all that material, because we not only had to have our own clothes, but we had all of the cotton material, we had the tent, and they had the cooking material. And now true, we didn't buy any more food than we would have probably need for a day, but nevertheless, it was a good car full of stuff, and it was a 4-door Model A Ford. And there were some times when it got to be a real chore, especially when we ran into some bad weather or storms. We ran into a I remember a terrific rainstorm one time. I think it was either in Iowa or in Nebraska, and it was one of those dandies where we stopped at the top of a hill, and because the valley below was flooded. And one time we got stranded for about 3 or 4 hours. We had to wait for the runoff so that the road would be clear enough so that we could bypass. And the roads at that time, most of them, except for the main highway, were gravel. They were earthen roads. And quite frequently you would run into washouts, especially after tremendous rains. And then occasionally we would have to detour because the roads had been washed out because of summer storms, rainstorms. And it was altogether, it was a very, very interesting trip. While I'm at it here, I might mention another trip one time that my brother Herman and I and Dad took, and we went to the Upper Peninsula. And we went across the ferry. This was probably about 1925 or 26, somewhere in there. And took the ferry over to St. Ignace for Mackinac. And then we proceeded along the, going west over toward Escanaba. I think the first night, as I remember, we stayed somewhere around Manistee, Michigan. There again, stopping at some schoolhouse for purposes of camping. We went on to Escanaba and then north up into near Marquette and Ishpeming and Negaunee, up to Lance, up to Houghton and Hancock, up to Calumet and Larium, and then up to the Keweenaw Peninsula. We went up to Copper Harbor and then went up to the very, very tip of the peninsula called Fort Wilkins, or Williams. And we stayed there for a day, and we did a little rock hounding and along the lake up there, and it was a very, very beautiful trip. Now the thing is that in that area, and on the way there and all the way back, Dad always used to find a place where he could fish a little trout. Dad, of course, was a trout fisherman. And I remember one occasion that when we came back out of there from back to Marquette, then we went along the south shore of Lake Superior. And we stopped at some place one evening to camp. There was a place, there was a campground, there was a nice little creek nearby. And we had inquired, Dad had inquired when we got to Marquette, and they told us that was a good place to fish trout. And so, okay, we set up camp, and Dad dug a few worms down by the creek there someplace and got some nice great big worms. And I'll be a son of a gun if he didn't catch 4 or 5 of the most beautiful trout, all about 10 or 12 or 13 inches long, enough to make a beautiful meal. And there was no trick at all to get those trout. So we had a fresh brook trout for that evening meal, caught right out of the stream, and that's where we camped. I remember that very. Then we went along there, and then we finally came back down across and came home. But altogether, we were gone probably about 10 days, as I remember, on that expedition. Very interesting trip for a dad and his 2 boys to take. And of course, we collected a lot of little artifacts along the way, pieces of native copper that we found, and spent some time. The college had just started up there at Houghton at that time, and Dad wanted to see that institution. Now I want to get on to another subject here while I think of it. You'll have to pardon my jumping around, but I talk about these things as they come to mind. In the old home, there on 3rd Street, of course, we always had dogs. Always a Kazan around. And, of course, what would happen occasionally is that you get up in the morning sometime, and here would be Kazan who had been out wrestling with a skunk. And, oh, man, it was just terrible. So there was only one thing to do, and that is to try to get the darn skunk smell out of the dog as soon as possible. Well, in the fall of the year, if it was right, there were several treatments that were used. If you had a lot of tomatoes, especially if they're ripe and very ripe, you could take the dog out and try to rub some of these tomatoes right into the fur. Now, using tomatoes to get the odor out of a dog nowadays, sometimes they recommend that you use tomato juice. Well, of course, we didn't have tomato juice in those days, but sometimes they did have tomatoes. But usually the standard procedure was to get out the tub, one of the wash tubs, and then get some Fell's naphtha soap and some semi-warm water, stick the dog in there, and then proceed to make a lather out of that soap. And boy, the dog knew what was happening. He would just stand there, and then we'd water the dog down, and then soap, then rinse him off, and then soap some more. And but as I say, in most cases, the dog knew enough that we were trying to probably help him, so he was very cooperative. But after about 2 or 3 baths like that, he got so he was livable again. You could have him in the house. But skunks, of course, were common in those days. They still are common around here right now. I see in our backyard every fall we can spot where the skunks have been around. You can always tell whether they're working in your backyard because they dig little holes looking for grubs. And sometimes you'll find your lawn pocked with large little hole diggings. But nevertheless, that's what happened. And then another thing that would happen occasionally is that the dog would come home and his whole mouth, all inside and out, was covered with porcupine quills. They'd wrestled with a porcupine. And he would look like a stuck pig, all full. Well, of course, it was very, very painful, and the dog was quite sick. So what we did was that we get the dog out in the backyard or sometime on the basement floor and sit on him, open up, then take a stick and shove it way back, stick maybe about 8-10 inches long, shove it way back in his mouth. Open up his mouth and then hold him down. You have to have kids hold his legs and help hold his head. And then you get a pair of pliers and then pull those quills out. It was very, very painful, but that's what you had to do. And sometimes they're inside the mouth. They're on top of the nose. And you hung on to it. The dog would whine and cry, but there wasn't much else you could do, in order to save the dog, because if those quills stayed in there too long, they would fester, and the dog would get sick for quite a while. Now, sometimes we would, before we start pulling them, we would take white vinegar on a rag and just kind of sprinkle it all over. It was supposedly that was supposed to soften up the quills so that they would come out easier. But of course, a quill has got little hooks on it, and that's what causes that thing to stick. And but that happened usually once a year or so, or once every 2 years. The dog running at night they'd get into porcupines, and not only our dog but the neighbors' dogs, of course, would probably be participating too. Because in most instances, unless they were hunting dogs, the dogs that we had, they ran free. They weren't cooped up, they weren't chained. They did have a dog house, but quite frequently the dog stayed inside most of the time anyway. Another thing that used to happen sometime was that quite often the dog would be left in the back shed overnight. Well, if it got a little cool in the back shed, we had one dog that was smart enough so that he would stand up on his hind legs and he would paw at the doorknob, and just at the right pressure, and by pawing and putting his weight against it, the door would fly open. Well, the only thing Dad said, he'd get up sometime in the night and hear the house would be cold as the dickens, because Kazan had come in out of the shed, but he didn't know enough to close the door. But that happened quite often, and but as Dad said, it wasn't so darn bad that he came in, but he said he was never smart enough to know if the door is shut again. So that frequently happened to her when you had dogs, and of course we always had dogs. So that ends that little episode about the skunks and the porcupines and the dogs in the Grambua family. Now I want to talk about another topic that I just happened to think about, and that is a hunting camp. Now, as a youngster, about 13 years old, I, and along with some of the neighbor kids, built a hunting camp up on the property, which would be now somewhere near the airport. The reason that came about was that we used to hunt up there. We hunted rabbit and hunted partridge up there, the young people in the neighborhood. And one of the people that lived up there, just off of 5th Street, was a man by the name of Maurer. And he had a son, Otto, who was just our age. And he had tried to farm that area up there, but it was just too damp, and it really wasn't successful. And so he kind of gave that up and wanted to increase the size of his garden. But he had several barns that were up there, and he wanted to get rid of one of them, which had been a large granary. I mean, there was a building about 12 by 16. And so he made a proposition to his kids. He said that if you tear that barn down for me, then he said, you can have the lumber and you can do with it what you want. Well, that was a grand idea for us to build a camp, because we had talked about building a camp, but the problem was, how do we get the poles, or how do we get the material to build it? Well, this was our chance. So the kids in the neighborhood got together, got the hammers and the saws and crowbars, and we tore the building down for them. And this was beautiful material. It had been a granary, and there were 2x4s and 2x6s. And there was vertical siding on it. It was made out of 6, 8, 10, 12, and even 14 or 16-inch boards. And it had about 4 windows in it, and it had a door in it. And so very carefully we dismantled that thing, and then we proceeded to find a place where we could build a camp. This was our chance. Well, we picked out an area, a piece of property, or a piece of ground on there, probably somewhere near where the airport is at the present time. And whether or not that was on Maurer's property or not, I don't know. I have an idea it belonged to one of the limestone company, either Salve Process or Inland or Michigan Line. But it is cut over land, but it was swampy. There was a lot of cedar on there. There was balsam, there was spruce, and there was popple, and in the higher ground there were a few white pine, and a lot of wild shrubs of all types, including hazelnut bushes. Well, we picked out a spot which was relatively clear, but which was also very close to a beautiful spring that we located in that area. Now, that area was located, had a lot of springs in it, and they fed into what was called Maurer's Pond. Immediately adjacent to that Maurer family up there, or Maurer property, was a pond. Oh, that, and it had a good head of water. And that was the source of the creek that flowed down through the property. You remember the old Bertram Creek? That's where that water came from. It came out of that pond. It flowed under 5th Street, under 4th Street, under the alleys, and under 3rd Street. It ran alongside through the Bertram property, through Dr. Arscott's property, right next to his house, and then ran along over to 2nd Street, and right in front of the old Michigan Limestone Chemical Company office building. There was a bridge built across the creek there in the spring of the year. Now, this creek only flowed in the spring of the year, and then the rest of the time it was dried up. But you recall the fun that we had in Bertram's Creek, which ran right through the full length of the property. But anyway, to get back to this other spring that we had there, where we built that camp. Now, a gang of us fellas, we lugged those pieces of wood, piece by piece. And it's probably, maybe about, I would say maybe 200 yards from the Maurer farm, inland. And there we proceeded to try to put that stuff back together again. Now, the old man Maurer, he did help us. He was kind of a carpenter by trade, and so he showed us how to put down the foundation, how to mount the base timbers on logs that had been set into the ground. We had pieces of cedar, probably about 8 or 10-inch cedar blocks that we put into the ground, and that was fastened with 2x4s and 2x12s or 2x6s, and that became the foundation. And then we proceeded from there. We had 2x4s, and we proceeded to build a slant roof shanty, or a camp. And it had windows. It had that granary that we took down had 4 windows in it. They're about 2x2, so we put them all together in one section, and we had a window there probably about 8 feet long. Now, Mr. Maurer showed us how to mount those windows, and he showed us how to mount the door that we took off, and the windows the glass was still intact. And so that helped us a lot. Well, we finally got that thing put together. It had a floor in it. We had 4 bunk beds that we had built out of, now I might say that the siding on that building was vertical siding. And the vertical siding was covered with a black tar paper. And the tar paper was held down with wooden slats, like a lath that is used for plastering. And so it was very comfortable, and it was a little bit more than what you would expect. And I know that our dad, came out there one time after we told him what we were doing, and he wanted to take a look to see what was going on. And so he had talked to Mr. Maurer, and Maurer told him to go and take a look at it. He said the kids did a pretty good job, and we did. And Dad was surprised at how well it looked. There we had some old crude tables and chairs and benches, and there was even an old wood stove that Mr. Maurer had given us that he originally had in his home, but he had taken and put it out in the shed after he got a new one. And so we used that, and we had a chimney that was made that extended through the side of the roof, or the side of the building, and he showed us how to protect that so that it wouldn't cause a fire. But so he was very, very helpful. Now, the gang of kids that put that thing together were all in that neighborhood, and there, as I say, we had 4 bunk beds. You could sleep 8 in there if you did. I think on 2 occasions there were probably 3 or 4 or 5 of us did stay out there overnight. And now here are some of the kids that were in that neighborhood that were in on that. There was Porky Elmer Bruning and his brother Earl. There was Reuben Bruning, who later was the head of Rogers City Electric here. There was Leonard Sawyer Fry, who was later sheriff. There was Norman Dulac, who became a carpenter. There was Max Wergel, who became a farmer. And there was Clayton Hopp. And there was Adolf Gross. There was Otto Maurer, who was the son of the Maurer that owned that property. And there was a kid by the name of Bill Hoke. There was Ziggy Ralph Zempel. There was Keith McDonald. And another one was Art Brecken. And then there was Merlin Pates. And a Gerhard Craiglow, and one of the Stricker boys. I don't know which one, but there were probably 12 or 13 kids that got involved in that thing. Now, these were all kids that hunted in that area. They used to hunt there for rabbits and hunted there for partridge. And it was, there was, after it was built, there was always somebody there practically every weekend would go out there. And they went out there to have some fun. They went out to play Spitzer. They probably went out to play a little rum, or they played Petty Ante, and it was just a good place to go and have some fun for these kids. And oh yes, I suppose occasionally somebody got a hold of some homebrew beer that they bought out there, or somebody's tapped their parents' wine cellar and a bottle got out there, and somebody said, well, that's where we also practice smoking, cigarettes and or the pipe. Now, you have to remember that even today there's quite an anti-cigarette campaign going on in this country. Well, at that time, it was very, very hard for a kid under 21 years of age to get cigarettes or tobacco, because even the merchants, they just wouldn't sell it to you. It was contrary to law. But now, of course, that has been relaxed quite a bit, as you know. Now, and as a result, of course, there was a lot of fun that went with that. Now we did have there. We had a good supply of water, and occasionally somebody would bring out coffee when they made coffee, and we had quite a few lunches out there. I always brought along some of mother's bread, or maybe some coffee cake, and but we went out there to hunt, and we did get rabbits. That was very, very common. Some of those kids had rabbit dogs, and they hunted there anyway, so that was just a good place to go. We also had a latrine. We built a latrine out there, and which was nothing more than a hole in the ground. Now, it did have a roof on it, which had a tar paper cover with some boards, but it had no sides. The side was all open. We didn't expect any girls or women to come around anyway, so it was well aired. And this place, of course, was strictly for a man. This was all macho man stuff. And I don't ever recall seeing a girl or a mother out there at that camp. And but there wasn't anything that was wrong that was going on there. Maybe the smoking was wrong, but nevertheless, there was nothing going on there that kids didn't do in town. And a lot of food was brought out there by the various kids who wanted to stay out there and camp all day. Now, that area, as I say, also had a good number. There were some high areas and some low areas in that area. If you go out there today, you'll see areas where there was a very, very heavy swamp. That was really, really thick and wet. And it's the same area. Part of that was, you recall when we built the high school and the elementary school up there on top of Heff's Hill. That was a cedar swamp, very, very heavy swamp, and it had a cover of about 3 to 4 feet of black muck on it that had to be scraped off before we could put the buildings up there. Well, that's where some of that was. In other places, the limestone and stuff was right on top of the ground. There was nothing there, and so but as I say, the area had been cut off of its pine and other big trees in lumbering days, and what was standing there now was just second growth. And but now somebody asked me here the other day when I was telling them about that, whatever happened to that camp? Well, it burned. Now fires, of course, we were always very, very fearful of fires in this whole area of northern Michigan. And, of course, people always had their kind of ear cocked to another Metz or a Sommel or a Millersburg that would burn out. But one of the fires, we had fires at the edge of town, and you got to remember in those days that the woods, the swamps started right there at the edge of town. Right where the town ended, that's where the woods started. It was heavy. Now, this was second growth, a lot of it, but nevertheless it was very, very heavy with cedar and other pines and other evergreen trees that would just explode in fire conditions. And I remember that as a young kid, probably in high school, going out and fighting fire below Ranky Hill. People were fearful of it. And but that, now you don't hear about it too much more, but every once in a while the fire, even today, gets going. And it burns out a good number of places located along some of the lakes where there isn't adequate fire protection, along the river bottoms where there isn't adequate fire protection. Even in the last several years, there are a good number of cabins were lost to fire. And of course, in the early days, before we had a city water system in Roger City, it was very, very, people kept their eye cocked to when there came forest fire time. So that's all, because forest fires were for real. There isn't any doubt about that. And because people, as I say, in this area, many had relatives who remember the tragedies that occurred in the years before.